Good. Very hard. Keep going down left. Looks good. Good. Let us start out. Come on down. Keep coming down. Very right.
U.S. tactics and strategies. Search and destroy. In 1967, the aim of American combat troops in Vietnam was to take the first NLF bases by attacking their bases in overwhelming strength. The Americans hoped that the NLF would stand and fight in conventional war, then annihilate them with their superior firepower and overwhelming numbers. The biggest operations involving helicopters were designed to take out large Viet Cong regiments. They wanted to damage the Viet Cong so bad that they couldn't carry on the war, but they failed to wipe out the Viet Cong's biggest units. Despite the loss of men and weapons, they came back stronger and even more determined to fight. By 1965, the mission of American combat troops in South Vietnam was changing fast. First to secure air bases, but now they were actively trying to find and hunt down the Viet Cong. On May the 18th, 1965, the first American units to arrive in the war was the 173rd Airborne Brigade. Operations. They started operations as their first task was to sweep and clear the air base in Saigon. The first 173rd Regiment met no real resistance. There were thousands of Viet Cong around the base, but they stayed hidden. More and more Americans poured in. The policy was questioned. How could a slow-moving, heavily armed, conventional army take on guerrilla units which were impossible to pin down? General Westmoreland, the head general of the Vietnam War, could find and pin down the guerrillas. In 1965, the U.S. surrounded a Viet Cong regiment of 2,000 men in Operation Starlight, and actually defeated them in a conventional battle. Now the next challenge came with the NVA regulars. The regiment of the 32nd and 33rd infiltrated from North Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, with the 66th Regiment not far behind, as their plan was to take the base of Pei Cu, which could split South Vietnam into two if they took Highway 19 as well. So the US countered this with the 1st Airborne Cavalry. They were the first in the world to use helicopters in a flying formation strategy, with over 1,500 strong and 400 machines and weapons, which was 5 times more than a normal infantry division. The NVA looked for a fight as well to see how their men would cope with American weapons and tactics. In a valley called La Drang, the search and destroy method was born. When the NVA retreated and the US pursued the enemy into the Cambodian border. With other tactics, the Americans performed rolling thunder of the valley of the next 10 days. On the valley for the next 10 days, the NVA was hunted down by the Americans. Even though retreating, they still fought back, but it was a clear-cut victory for the US, and the generals thought that the NVA and Viet Cong could be drawn into battles and they would stay and fight. Rolling thunder was introduced to stop the flow of supplies from reaching the NVA and Viet Cong. The next stage was going on the offensive, with the Viet Cong was to make enemy with the Viet Cong, which would make the enemy get into a big formation and eliminate them one by one. Search and destroy, as the name would suggest, was to find the enemy and pin him down and smash them to pieces until they were eliminated, often with massive firepower. Westmoreland thought he could wear the Viet Cong down by relentless attrition He wanted to lure the Viet Cong to dry up men and weapons and supplies faster. Success was only scaled by how many supplies were destroyed, bases knocked out, and above all else, the body count. The places the US saw vital to protect were Saigon, the Mekong Delta, Da Nang, and Quy Nhon, which could be springboards for larger search and destroy missions around the base area. The Americans in the South planned to take over fighting from the South Vietnamese. The Americans were more mobile with higher firepower. Only the elite South Vietnamese regiments would take part in any offensive. Most of the Vietnamese army were on either police duty or standby. Wanted to counter the guerrilla by outnumbering them 10, even 15 to 1 to outmatch them and overwhelm them, but the generals taught the NLF and NVA were one in the same, so they decided that a 3-to-1 odds was more than enough. The South Vietnamese set up base camps, caught 1 to 4. As the Americans came, so did the Australians, the Kiwis, the New Zealanders, which are the Kiwis, the South Koreans, and even Philippine units. The US had a massive build-up of nearly 30 tons a month, so much that they had to make their own docks to ease pressure off the South Vietnamese docks. Since it was a Cold War conflict, most Americans had at least some experience in military training and fighting. Some military advisors before the Vietnam escalated into a US conflict were either veterans of the Korean War or World War II. The various weapons at the US disposal, such as the M14 rifle, which was reliable but unstable when fully automatic, but a new weapon was coming, a weapon that would be known as the M16, which was made out of plastic and a metal alloy, with a very high rate of fire and lightweight. It was the perfect weapon for search and destroy. At first, the first model would jam and was very unreliable, but as newer iterations were made and several changes were modified, the M16 would prove to be the Americans' weapons of choice. The LNGs, they had the M16 and the Stoner 66, but the most iconic and most remembered was the M16. It was very valuable, with a range of 1,000 yards and 100 bullets a minute. It was ideal for missions with a 2-man crew, or it could be fired from the hip, Rambo style. And it was robust and tough and suited for the jungles and other things Vietnam had to try. Good calling air support anytime, anywhere. It was just a phone call away from mortars and napalms. And they had artillery guns as well, which was still used in the war, with the biggest artillery piece being 170 millimeter